So it's a great pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. First, of course, IIMs have always been very near and dear to my heart, having graduated from one of them many years ago. And particularly this kind of conference where there's an opportunity for a lot of us to get together to talk about some important issues. We heard this morning about some important issues we ought to talk about in terms of our research. And during the course of this talk, if we wanted to spend some time on that topic, I'd be happy to do so. I wanted to focus my attention, at least for the first part of my comments, on what I think we need to think about in terms of the MBA program. Some of you probably familiar with the book on rethinking the MBA, where we challenge very much whether the kind of business education we have given over the last 40, 50 years should be the kind of business education we ought to continue to provide over the next 20, 30 years. So I will talk a little about that challenge because not everybody in the room probably familiar with those ideas. I'll then talk about some of the research that we did in India, talking to Indian students, Indian executives on what their needs were with respect to business education in India. And I'll close with some experiments that are currently being run on rethinking the MBA, both here as well as in Europe and Latin America and North America, just to again share with you a few ideas. And as we did this morning, I'll then open it up for questions from the audience, and we'll take it wherever you want to take it at that point. So I just going to spend a little time on the first of these, just giving you an overview of what the key ideas were in rethinking the MBA. And then, as I said, I'll talk a little about the Indian context and then about some experiments. So when we, as I might have mentioned in some of my earlier talks, but those of you not familiar with it, we went into this book on, which was not even planned to be a book, this research project on business education by accident. Harvard Business School happened to be celebrating its centennial in 2008. And of course, 100 years is a long time for an institution to survive. So we were obviously celebrating to some considerable extent what the institution has meant and what the contributions were from the alumni to scholarship and so on. And then, of course, we thought we ought to look at what is the current state of business education and ask ourselves whether we reaffirm it, say that it's in very good shape, or should we argue that, in fact, there is some need for change in business education. And so that was it was nothing, no crisis caused us to look at it. I also say you got to be a little bit crazy to take a topic like this because it's a very vast topic. The last major study of business education, really major one, 1959, the two Carnegie Corporation and Ford Foundation reports on business education in 1959. The next serious one, 1998, Porter and McGivens. But after that, of course, no work had been done on this topic. So it was a good time to look at it. And we were not expecting to see the kind of data that I have just put up here, which is that if you think about what was happening with respect to globalization, as we heard earlier this morning, we might have thought that US business schools, which have the lead in management education, would have demand for their programs that far exceed anything that matches their ability to take these students in. So we thought, you know, this is just a fantastic time to be in business education if you're a US business school. So I won't tell you which numbers each of these are, but they are the top 36 business schools in the US. We did a similar thing for Europe. I have subsequently repeated this study in Latin America as well. And the results were actually quite striking and to some extent to us alarming, which is that once you leave the top 15 schools, these are actual enrollments in MBA programs at the top US business schools in this period from 2000 to 2008, at a time when China is embracing the market economy. Obviously, India is embracing it as well. And the demand for business education couldn't have been greater, and yet we can't fill seats in the top MBA programs. And so the question for us was,
why is this happening? What is the reason for it? And we went through probably interviewing about 3,000 executives by the time we finished our research project, so large amount of data. Of course, this has been controlled for in every which way you can, looking at GMAT taking, has that gone down, has the number of admissions gone down per school? So controlling for the usual things, still quite an alarming picture. I won't go through all the detailed reasons for it, but I'll just end on the last point that we make here, which is we consistently heard that there are serious questions being raised about the value added of the MBA programs. And of course, I'll talk about what happens with respect to value added of these MBA programs in India in a minute, but I just want to first just summarize what the key points were. And if I look at what the data in India suggests, and what our executives that we interviewed here telling us about our students: strong analytical capabilities, broad functional knowledge, good understanding of management concepts, good general business knowledge. So all the things that we might expect is happening in our MBA programs was confirmed. And then we asked what are areas of weakness? Where might our management education not be delivering as much as we would want to deliver? And we ended up with a list that was a little bit bigger than what we had discovered when looking at rethinking the MBA in the US. And here's a list of those particular skills. So weak in thinking skills, particularly when it comes to critical thinking skills. This was actually a little bit of a surprise to us. So they said our students were very good when it came to analysis. They could look at a problem analyze it to a considerable extent. But when it came to actually making a decision, or as you were asking this morning, and actually solving a problem, that's where things were hamstrung. And that was a concern as to why is it that when it comes to decision-making skills, after all, if you think about management education, the first thing you ought to be saying we do a good job of is help our students make decisions, and yet significant concerns on the part of executives on our students' ability to do that. Communication skills, of course, this is not something that has been emphasized very much in business education, clearly came. Innovative thinking. And I will shortly describe an experiment that I've just finished running at the Harvard Business School, offering a course on teaching innovative thinking. So can you actually teach this material? Is it a teachable skill? Is it a learnable skill? And I'll say a little more about that a little later. Understanding of organizational realities. Again, many of our students don't come with much work experience, unlike what we might do in business schools in the rest of the world. Concerns about leadership. We heard that this morning as well. What is it that, how do you take responsibility? How do you work with others? I'll say a lot more about this later on. Because at the end of the day, no manager is good having got a lot of knowledge by himself or herself. Management is not an individual sport. It's not like being a surgeon where you're very skilled at doing what you're doing. You've got to get a team around you. You've got to be able to understand them well. You've got to be able to inspire them, motivate them. So are we doing enough of that in terms of helping our students appreciate it? And I'll say a little more about that later. Ethical behavior, adaptability, learning attitude, things again that I'll touch upon in a minute. I won't go through this in the interest of time, but I did want to pause a little bit on what the basic framework is of the book, and then what some of these experiments are that are going on. So the basic framework of the book is that if you think about management, we can broadly break it up into three parts. There's things that every manager or a management professional ought to know. So we call that the knowing components, facts, frameworks, theories that make up the core understanding of a profession or practice. But if you're interested in developing management professionals who can actually do something with it, then the question is, are there a set of skills that we ought to develop that are what we then labeled doing skills? So skills, capabilities, and techniques that lie at the heart of the practice of management. And I'll again take one example from each of these categories to describe what I think needs to happen with respect to management education. But How do you conduct a performance review? One of the most common things we heard is that our students, when they go out and they're leading a team, have no ability to have difficult conversations when it comes to motivating their teams or helping them improve their performance, giving them good performance feedback. These are skills that they don't have, and it's sort of, to me, the 101 skill of management. How do you engage with people who are responsible, who you work with, to both help them improve, develop them, give them feedback when they don't work very well? We tend to shy away from doing that, and we heard this loud and clear in our comments from executives. I'll say a little more about innovation as it applies to this particular skill. And then being, which is the values, beliefs that form managers' worldviews and their professional identities. And the basic argument we made in the book was that if you think about knowing, it's sort of the foundation. You have to have a certain set of concepts, knowledge, understanding of what management is about. But if I don't do anything with it, which we labeled in the book as the knowing-doing gap, then what you know isn't particularly helpful if I am not able to do things with it. And to do things with it, because it's not an individual sport, it's not what I do with it, but how do I get people around me to do things, good things with it, is what we then labeled as being. And we argued that if you're not, our argument for rebalancing is that much more needs to be done on the doing and being skills. And if those skills aren't developed, then you've got a lot of students who might be very good analytically, might be very good in consulting jobs, might be very good in financial services jobs, but if we're trying to address the kinds of issues that our speakers this morning were trying to have us think about, these are not necessarily the skills in our view that we are developing in any MBA program. And to me, I think if you look at the top business schools in the US, we send about 75 to 80% of our students into two professions: consulting and financial services. And of course, our programs, if they're designed to meet those particular needs, doesn't matter. We have fantastic ability to put our students into those professions, and they do very well. But if those programs aren't meeting the needs of where all the other students go, and everyone else is copying the programs that these schools have designed, then of course there's a mismatch between what we are doing with respect to developing our students' capabilities and what we need to prepare them for. So what we basically argue is that until you are able to lead, you're able to influence others, you're able to work with a team, you can't do anything. And if you can't do anything, all the knowledge that we are filling you with is much less useful because you aren't able to act on it. So not just the what of management, which is the knowledge, but the how of management, which is what you do with it, and the why of management, which is the being skills, all need to be developed to a significantly greater extent, is the argument in rethinking the MBA. So if I go to a couple of these just to give examples and then help us see what it is that we're talking about, I'll talk about the knowing part, which I actually, in the book, we say we do pretty well at. But the thing about knowing that we have to be very careful about is that knowing is different from thinking. And so I've often used this particular analogy, and it's been a very important way in which we sort of conceptualize what we were trying to think about the book. So let me try and see if I can explain it. So if my right hand is all the knowledge you need to know to make a decision, and if my left hand is no knowledge, I know nothing, I have to still decide, then obviously much of management research and management thinking has been devoted to moving my left hand towards my right hand, because I'm trying to fill in all the gaps in knowledge that exist so that I have all the knowledge that I would need to make a decision. Fact of the matter is, even if my right hand didn't move, no matter how much theory I give you, no matter how much framework I tell you, no matter what concepts I feed you with, there's going to be a gap between what it is that we know and what it is that I would like to know when I have to make a particular decision. Just because context is important, contingencies are important, human interactions are important, Lots of other factors that are outside our theories are important when we decide. So there's going to be a gap. Not to even point out that the right hand is actually moving out as well. So you think about globalization and you think about the challenges that competition that comes about, shorter product life cycles. So that's moving out as well. So there's always going to be a gap between what you know and what you'd like to know when you're making a decision. Of course, you're dealing with things that are uncertain. And so the point we were trying to get at is it possible for us to reframe what it is that we do when we think about management education? So rather than say that our goal in management education is always to move the left hand towards the right, can I fundamentally rethink that and argue that the goal of management education is to make our students comfortable living in these gaps, because the world is not going to be so clean that I can have all the information that I want at the time I want it in order to make a decision. And it's in living in those gaps that led us to ideas like critical thinking, integrative thinking, innovative thinking, where you are firmly in the gap. You cannot do anything but make decisions without knowing everything that you want to know. And how you think through things in those particular contexts is what really makes management education and the knowing skills coupled with the thinking skills powerful. So I'll say a couple of things about each of these. As I said, I won't go through all of these, just to give you an idea about what schools are trying to do as they're thinking about these things differently. So I'm going to start with critical thinking, and they're basically the usual things that we typically think about when we think about critical thinking. Developing and articulating logical, coherent, and persuasive arguments, marshalling supporting evidence, understanding what is fact and what is opinion. So the course that we highlight here, and there have been many courses that have now been developed following this particular thing, is a course at the Stanford Business School on critical analytical thinking. It's a first quarter course. So it's a course that is offered in the very first term as soon as you get to the Stanford Business School. And again, it's a very particular reason why they do it in the first quarter, because in the first quarter you know very little else, right? Remember, you're trying to make people comfortable in thinking in the gap. So if you're trying to make them comfortable in thinking in the gaps, that gap is the biggest when you get into business school. You don't have any idea about any particular topic, and yet you're trying to see how do you think and reason in those contexts. Taught in a seminar format, and this is going to be a recurring theme. Part of our concern is that unless we fundamentally rethink pedagogies, we're very used to and very comfortable in the pedagogies that we are using, and so we continue to deliver things on that same pedagogy. Sometimes these ideas are going to require us to rethink what pedagogies we use, because the same pedagogy will not work to deliver the kind of skills that we're talking about here. So taught in a seminar format, 14 to 16 students, one tenure line faculty, plus in some cases a practitioner or adjunct. Weekly cycle, students read and write, written assignment due on Wednesday, graded on Thursday, seminar discussion on Friday. So when the faculty member comes to class, he or she already knows exactly what the different opinions are that students have on the topic that they've been asked to think about. 7 such cycles, not so important. And the interesting point, I think, that was made in this particular course is that we don't force our students to write nearly as much as we should. It's the process of writing that often helps us clarify our thinking. So when you're asked to write from beginning to end a set of arguments for a particular situation in which you've been put, it helps you to clarify your thinking a lot more. So what are the kinds of topics they talked about? You'll see very little to do directly with business. Should Google stay in China with Google.cn? These are all current topics. You know that there was this big issue about whether Google would have to give up a lot of information that they had to the Chinese government, particularly when it came to their dissidents. So should they be in China or not? There's a lot of dispute in the US right now about K-12 public education. Should it be publicly provided, publicly financed? How about torture was going on at the time? This was era of Abu Ghraib and others, and the question was, when you're doing these kinds of things, should you use rules or should you use discretion? By the way, the exact same thing happens when an employee comes to you and says he or she is about to leave. Should you use a rule to say, yes, you will allow the person to leave or not allow the person to leave? If you fit the rules, we'll negotiate. Or do you use discretion? Do you deal with different employees in different ways? no right answers, in most cases require tools that the students don't yet have. Topics are interesting, but the real content is how do you attack such questions? How do you think about these questions when they are posed? And then they go through a series of techniques that are helpful in this case. When should you use deductive arguments? When should you use causative reasoning? When should you use inductive arguments? When should you use analogical reasoning? How do you reason and argue? How do you read and listen critically? How do you now, when you hear a different point of view, absorb that point of view, modify your own position or reaffirm your position? So it's clarity and soundness. You're not trying to persuade somebody about the other person's point of view, but are you thinking about it clearly and soundly? Integrative thinking, and again, I won't have much time to talk about this because I'm happy to take questions on this later on, but this came up a number of times. So for instance, in the discussion about, where do we go beyond profits and what should we think about, is it a shareholder view or a stakeholder view that you should take? And again, some fascinating research showing that companies that have taken the stakeholder view have indeed done very well, and why they have done well and what's the reason behind it, we can all talk about later, but it's how do you do it? By the way, should I empower my employees to act or should I control them? Because you worry about risk on the one hand, and the other hand you want to let people develop and grow. So how should I deal with these conflicting views? And what integrative thinking teaches you is thinking about integrative thinking as a meta skill, that you ought to be able to hold two conflicting ideas in your head and not get confused. We all like to simplify it and just take one particular idea and shut out all the other ideas. Important other contributions that people are making to our thinking, we want to shut it out. And it requires our brains to be trained in a particular way for that to happen. So again, a lot of very interesting work going on how do you teach integrative thinking in business schools. I won't say much more about this, but one attempt at this was in the Yale School of Management, where rather than teaching accounting and finance and OB and marketing the way we've typically taught it, they took these constituent views. So think about a competitor, about a customer, about an investor, and then bring together all the aspects of knowledge that you want to bring together in order to address what those needs might be. Thinking creatively and innovatively, finding and framing problems. So this is a doing skill. And here, again, I think it's very important not to get stuck in our pedagogies. So in the course that I just offered at the Harvard Business School, even for a Harvard professor, I used only one case. So, we're very fond of our case method of instruction. It has, of course, served us well for many years, but in my mind, innovative thinking, you're not going to learn by the case method. As we say, those of you familiar with the argument in the book, we say learning how to think innovatively and creatively is a little bit like learning how to swim or play the piano. I'll never teach my kids how to swim or play the piano by the lecture method. Won't give them a long lecture on it and say, here's how you go about playing the piano. I would definitely not teach them swimming or playing the piano by the case method. How do you swim? How do you swim? No. You put them in the pool, get them to practice, get them to make mistakes, correct those mistakes, and that's how you learn. I don't think every single skill that we want to teach in business schools can be taught in the way in which we are most comfortable delivering it, which is often through a lecture or through a case. And so in this particular course, we did no lectures, no cases. Everything was a hands-on assignment. Everything was based on trying. Yet there is an innovative thinking process that you can teach. I'll say a little about that in a second. That is extremely helpful for students to learn what it is. I'll skip past that. I don't know if it's very visible, but we go through the 7-step process in teaching someone how to think innovatively. And for me, it was a learning experience. First question is it a teachable skill? And if it is a teachable skill, how can it be done? And of course, the biggest concern for me is, even if it's a teachable skill and can be done, am I capable enough to do it? So you had 3 variables there to worry about. I came away from the course the first time that I've offered it, concluding that it absolutely can be done, because I could see what the students were doing from the time they started the course to what they finished. And I'll just point out that one of the things that we are beginning to work with both IIM Ahmedabad and IIM Calcutta, is to try and offer a workshop. We are thinking around July 18th, 19th, and 20th at SP Jain, where I was actually going to give all this material that we did on innovative thinking and share it with whoever in an Indian business school faculty member is interested in teaching this material at your schools. We're going to write to a number of schools, see if you want to come and do it. Professor Rishikesh Krishnan and I will lead that session, because we think that there's material here that can be learnt, can be taught, can be developed, but it is one of those where you got to have repeated practice. The more you practice it, the more you do it, the better you get at it. It's not one of these that you'll immediately learn. And so I'm, again, Ajay and Saibal and others, we're all looking at this to see how best to do it. And hopefully we'll be able to offer this in sometime in July. I won't go through the range of techniques, but I did want to cover why I'm saying that we have to be willing to shed some of the pedagogies that we have been using before. So this is the kind of pedagogy that I've been using in this particular course. So it's not a single stool students. In fact, I recruited for this course all 7 schools at Harvard University, all the graduate schools. So medical school, law school, Kennedy School, education school, design school, School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. I had students from all of them. Because the diversity of view and diversity of thinking that comes from having such students come together is fantastic. Not individuals, but teams. My role was not so much to be a professor over there. I would give them readings, I'd give them things. We were designing projects for them to work on and getting them to work on it. Very little of lectures and assignments, almost all of it exercises and projects. Not analytical problem solving, but emergent problem solving. Not thinking and debating, because when you're being innovative, that's not what you got to do. You got to keep trying different things, learning fast, learning what you ought to change. Not subject expertise, but process expertise. So very different from the standard way in which we tend to think about our business school courses. But I think if you're going to do this, and if you really do believe that this skill can only come from repeated practice, then fantastic to do it. If I had my druthers, I would say that courses like critical thinking, innovative thinking ought to be done in the first semester of a business school program, so that students have a lot of ability to keep practicing that skill over the next 2 years that they're in the program, whether they're in marketing or operations and taking those particular courses, because it's a skill that's different than just knowing what the material is in a particular course. I want to say a little bit about experiential learning, because I actually have come to increasingly believe that the more we are stuck in our classrooms in business education, the less we will get engaged with the sets of issues that we ought to get engaged with. And actually, I'll start with an example that comes from physics. It's a fascinating example, because one of the very famous physicists at Harvard is a professor by the name of Professor Mazur, Eric Mazur. And he was teaching physics to the Harvard class. In this case, was a required course. In other words, it was a core course, not an elective course. So the people taking the course came from a very wide range of backgrounds. He taught them, of course, Newton's third law of motion. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And on the exam, he gave a very simple problem. He said, there's a big truck that hits a small car. And when it hits the small car, the car is thrown way off as a result of the impact with the truck. Which object hit the other with greater force? Of course, if you know Newton's third law, you would say that they hit each other with equal force, because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And he was shocked that so many Harvard students said that the big truck hit the small car with greater force, because that's what your intuition is. And so even though you might have the knowledge, his inability to begin to apply that knowledge was so great, he completely changed. He'll win the Nobel Prize in physics at some point, absolutely spectacular scientist, but he completely changed the way in which he teaches physics now. So this gap between understanding of concept and being able to apply it is a very important gap that we should take seriously if we're going to start addressing the kinds of issues and problems that both of you were describing this morning. We have to be able to engage with that problem. You've got to be able to understand that problem. It's not something that you sit in a classroom and get to appreciate. So the the experiments that are going on, in this case at the Leeds Business School in the UK, and I'll talk a little about the experiment that we're doing at Harvard currently. They've completely redesigned the MBA program in a fascinating way. What they've said is, we're going to design our entire curriculum runs around the track. That's what they call it. So they're going to make their students run around the track 4 times. Which means that in a 1-year program, they're going to send their students out to actually look at real problems 4 times in the course of the year. First, new ventures. If you're going to start a new venture, what would you do? And now what they do when they're covering the material, in that first quarter, they'll only cover material that is directly tied to new venture issues. So you talk about innovation, you talk about creativity, you talk about entrepreneurship, you talk about finance, entrepreneurial finance. So they'll really focus on those issues so their students can engage with those issues as they are applying it and learning from it. Then they'll put them into a leadership challenge and say, if you were running a small team, what are the issues that you would face and what are the materials that you should know? Then there's a consulting challenge. If you are acting as a consultant to a company, what are the kinds of materials you would know? So that's taught and you are actually doing a consulting project. And then they call it the boardroom challenge, but that's if you're an executive and a senior level in a company. Now you might want to know competitive strategy, you might want to know aspects of corporate finance, you might want to know issues about governance. So what are the issues? So each time the material that is taught and the experience is tied and coupled closely together. We are doing a slightly related experiment where we are trying to understand what does it mean to do this experiential learning. So we have now got a required course that has no cases. We call it Field, and it's got 3 components. Field 1 is leadership development. So we spend a lot of time trying to develop leadership capabilities in our students. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. There's a global immersion experience. So then students go all over. All 900 of our students will go to all parts of the world and actually do a project in those countries. So no just going and visiting companies. They actually study the country, study the company, go there and actually collect data, go do interviews with those people, because you're really trying to engage in global issues. That's what you do. And some of these designs are fantastic, because what we will do is perhaps send people out to look at a marketing problem in 4 different countries. When they come back, they say, you know, I went to India, I had the same marketing issue, I want to market a particular product, but here were my problems. When I went to Brazil, they were a little different. When I went to Russia, it was a totally different thing. And so how might you then come back and learn about what's happening in different countries and what are the institutional specific things that travel and don't travel? And then we have an interesting thing with Field 3, which is on new product development, where the students are asked to actually, given a certain amount of money, and are actually asked to develop a new business and actually implement that new business. In the other classroom, those particular students act as venture capitalists, and so they bid on how good these ideas are. So how do you decide whether a particular idea is a good idea or not? And then of course you actually conduct that business over the course of the term. So really getting people to get into the field, and the amount of learning they're getting in terms of what is the theory and what gets applied and where do the gaps come has been enormously successful. So we've been very pleased with this innovation in our curriculum. I'll close with the development of leadership skills. Clearly a very important thing. There are 4 things that we want to worry about. 2 that we spoke about this morning in spades. There is understanding what is the purpose of business and the responsibilities of leadership. So what is a responsible leader supposed to do when they are running a large corporation? How do they think about social factors? How do they think about other stakeholders? What does it mean to lead in a world like that? How do you understand yourself much better? So we have what are called leadership laboratories, where we try and get our students to think deeply about their own strengths, about their values, about their weaknesses, and what do they do? Do they decide too quickly? Are they able to give feedback? Are they trying to be too nice? Are they not candid? What are their strengths and weaknesses, and how might they improve it? A big focus on trying to understand people who are different from you. And we try to do that in our experiential learning context when they go out, as well as in these leadership laboratories. Because the biggest problem we have, if you're going to lead people, if you're going to manage teams, impossible to do that unless you deeply understand people who are very different from you. So most of our students have not encountered a factory worker. Most of our students have not understood how these folks live and what their issues are. So how are you going to motivate them? You think, yeah, you want to give them more money and that's what will motivate them. We don't know that. It's just an assumption that we make. You've never interacted with them. You've never dealt with them. By the way, then what about designers who think very differently? And what about marketing folks who think very differently? Where is the connection? How do you lead people who you don't know? And so we're trying very hard to get them to deeply understand people who are different from themselves. Build in them this very important skill of empathy, whether you're thinking about empathy with a customer or whether you're thinking about empathy from the point of view of your employees. Very important thing to develop. And then how do you inspire and influence and guide? Once you understand that, then how do you inspire, influence and guide others? And one of the important lessons we learned in working on rethinking the MBA that is the feeling that many managers describe to us, that the world is changing from a situation where leaders had high authority and low conflict to one where leaders increasingly have low authority and high conflict. And the kind of leadership skills, leadership capabilities, leadership challenges, leadership styles that will work in one is going to be a disaster in the other. So how do you build that kind of leadership capability so that you can actually develop that skill? I won't say much more about many things that we do in terms of various techniques, tools that we use, individual coaching that we do, mentoring that we do, but this is a very serious effort at the moment at the business school, and one that we are increasingly learning from and pushing very hard, because we do believe that this point on leadership, the courage to act, the ability to act with integrity, the ability to have difficult conversations, the ability to give feedback, are just perhaps very crucial management skills, as much as knowing how to do net present value analysis or understanding what it is to run a particular regression in a particular way. I won't say much about gaining a global perspective. I've already referred to that. And but really it's about how do you be a general manager in a global world. But I did want to say a couple of things about new emerging issues, because they again had come up in the morning discussion. One of the things that we are paying, in addition to innovation, the other thing that we are paying big attention to at this point is what we are calling big data. And by the way, I feel in India this has got to be one of the big advantages we have, that the ability to look at data in much more interesting ways than what we've ever been able to do before. The amount of data that is being captured and the ability to look at it in very interesting ways is huge. But the techniques here are very new and different. So things like select vector machines, trees, lots of new techniques that are being developed. So these are not even yet in the coursework in most places, but we're beginning to start thinking about what we would do in a world where there is much more information and a vast amount of it. How do you begin to make sense of it, and how do we train our students to do that? And then of course we are spending a lot of time, as I think both of you were describing this morning, on blended learning models, and we are learning a ton. And it'll be an interesting thing. I don't know where this is going to go, because this is going to be an interesting issue. It'll be an interesting thing for us to talk about later. Because it is entirely possible that when it comes to this knowing part, we will over the next 5 or 8 or 10 years develop the knowing part so well, and let's supposing it's, let me just concentrate on the US for the moment. Will it be the case that people will film several of our faculty colleagues at the top schools, and those things are going to be made available? We'll figure out, at the moment it's a not-for-profit thing. Many people who take the course get it for free. You don't have to pay anything for it. And if this goes into all the other schools, so this becomes an opportunity where you don't really need a professor standing in front of the class delivering standard knowledge that you were used to them thinking. I think from an Indian context, this actually might be an interesting opportunity, because we were talking about Right to Education Act and what's going to happen when all these folks are educated, what's going to happen with respect to where are we going to build that many universities, and will it be an opportunity to say, let's say there'll be people at IIMs giving these lectures and they're available to people elsewhere in the country to take. Who knows? But that's what we are working on. As we heard this morning, these MOOCs, as they are called, currently have 150,000 students from all over the world taking these courses, And it's not just a one-way thing now. We're trying to understand how we can do one-to-one learning. How can you understand where someone doesn't understand a concept and where can they be led? So fascinating stuff happening. The latest innovation that has occurred in that is they're trying actually to see if they can grade an essay. So usually we thought, okay, I can grade a quant problem, or I can grade a finance problem, but now we're trying to understand, can you grade an essay? Can I look at an essay? Can a machine look at an essay and come to a conclusion as a human being would, whether it's a good essay or not a good essay? And there's some interesting experiments going on currently as we speak on that dimension, and it'll be interesting to see where we end up on it. But I think it's a major trend that we'll have to figure out what are the issues that will come up in India with respect to it, and what are the opportunities that it will generate. So I'll just close with where I started, know, do, and be, the ability to do thinking skills. This morning, of course, we had a couple of references to Mahatma Gandhi. I happen to be an ardent and huge admirer of Gandhiji. And I always, when writing the book, thought that in a very interesting way, at least 3 of Gandhiji's skills. We have a beautiful portrait of Mahatma Gandhi in our executive education facility. If you're teaching exec ed and you go to the exec ed building at Harvard Business School, you cannot miss a beautiful portrait of Gandhiji there. And under it are his 7 deadly sins. And at least as I'm thinking about rethinking the MBA, our view is that 3 of his deadly sins we ought not to commit. And we are at the risk of committing it. Knowledge without character. Don't want to give people a lot of knowledge if you're not doing character. That's being. Science without humanity. Don't just think that everything can be done in scientific ways when there is a human aspect lurking right behind it. And of course, the most obvious, business or commerce without morality, and the need to understand ethics, and as I described a little bit earlier on. So in an interesting way, maybe the book does nothing more than say that we ought to go back to some of his teachings and say, are we, in delivering good education, really going back to what our core values to humanity, as we continue to develop in many interesting ways the science of management and the practice of management. So let me close at that. Thank you for your attention, and happy to take questions. Go ahead.
I think I have 2 comments actually. I think there is a little bit of unfairness when we talk about the decision-making capacity problems of the Indian MBAs, say for instance vis-a-vis the American MBA students, particularly when we don't relate the social context. In USA, the children are taught to be independent right from childhood. Mm-hmm. And they learn many things on their own. Mm-hmm. Parental care there may be luck, matter of luck rather than design. Whereas in India, right through one's age, all ages, up to graduation, beyond that career decisions, beyond that marriage, beyond that even children, grandchildren, mm-hmm. somebody else is taking the decisions for them. Mm-hmm. So there is no social context for social motivation for Indian children or Indian young people to take decisions. Mm-hmm. And this may be carried throughout their life. Yeah. So MBA institutions alone may not be able to change this unless the social context itself changes. Yeah. The second thing is that you have contrasted the emergent problem solving with analytical problem solving. And I think there is no substitutability between the two. If you emphasize more on the emergent problem-solving skills, you are compromising to a great extent on the long run, and the planning doesn't make any sense in that case. Mm-hmm. So there is a complementarity of the two, mm-hmm. and I think substitutability is not the right thing to do. Right. By doing that, we are making the children, the students very short-sighted. Yeah. like the US stock market?
Yeah, so I think two comments on I thought the first one you might go in a slightly different direction in which you went. So first is, I agree completely that the social context is different for the reasons that you described. But the second is, of course, we have a lot more students who come with work experience to the business schools there, which you did not mention. And we have almost no work experience by the time you come. So talk about doing skills, not understanding what the issues are, not understanding what the context is, not a surprise to me that then when you go into the workplace for the first time, you said, you know, I can't apply this theory, I just don't know what to do with it. You just don't have that background, and it might be an issue about whether in fact we're doing this correctly from the point of view of how we are going through the program. So, but I agree with the second point as well. And by the way, huge differences in the way in which the education system also works in both those cases, and it might be a useful thing again for us to think about. So when it comes to the decision making, as you said, for and I'll actually connect this thing to this emergent problem solving. So I have no disagreement. I do not think of these things to be substitutes at all. As I said, my concern is about rebalancing. My concern is that where emergent problem solving should be used, which by the way, if you look at the course on innovation, you cannot do it analytically, cannot. We don't know how to do it because we never taught ourselves how to do emergent problem solving. We only know analytical. Every time you're going, you're trying to do analytical, it won't work. But I 100% agree with you that this is not a substitute. The point is, but you're not even teaching them a skill. It's 0 and 100. I'm saying at least make it 20 and 80. And then people will figure out, and as you combine it with critical thinking, you'll figure it out. So I'll combine both these points in a very interesting way. And I had this experience, of course, being an Indian parent when my daughter was going through school. I remember, must have been 4th grade or 3rd grade. Came home, brought an essay. I looked, she said, Dad, look, my teacher's written absolutely fantastic essay. Superb, you know, excellent. I said, oh, so I want you to see it. I look at it and I'm trying to hide my embarrassment. Full of grammatical mistakes, syntax errors, punctuation errors, capital, everything is I'm just looking at it and I'm seeing error after error. So I said, and of course the teacher hasn't marked any of it. So I go to the parent-teacher conference and I said, you know, I just want to know how you're sort of thinking about it because my daughter thinks she's doing great. And I look at it and I see all the errors, you know, that here. So should I help her? What should I do? He said, no. What I'm trying to teach your child is how to be creative, how to be innovative, how to think differently. These rule-based stuff, she'll figure it out by the time she's in 6th grade or 7th grade. But if I kill that instinct now, she'll never again be able to get it at a later point in time. So please don't interfere with the thing. Sure enough, by the time Radhika was in 6th or 7th grade, she was able to overcome all those things. But the focus was on how do you think creatively? How do you think innovatively? How do you challenge yourself to rise above the mechanical parts of it? So it's a very different thing across a whole range of things. I don't disagree with that at all.
Thank you, Dr. Datar. You spoke about knowing, doing, and being. And you have presented some very beautiful Western cases. In India also, many B schools are thinking about this. I'm faculty of Goa Institute of Management. And we at IIM, we are also thinking about innovations in our curriculum, innovations in our pedagogy. We have the thinking skills which you were talking about. Professor Verneker is here. He has launched this course 4 years back. So we have this thinking skill, thought management, creativity, innovation. Recently, 2 years back, we have launched another course, Service Learning Project, Give Goa, where we ask our all first-year students to take up projects with NGOs and government organizations. They go, they connect with society, they work with them closely, they learn what is their problems, they provide solutions, try to provide solutions, work as a bridge. So, you know, many Indian B schools are also trying to do, and we have realized at IIM especially that experiential learning works better. So simulation, role plays, more and more, courses, perspective-builded courses. Like we have course on rural marketing, sustainability. We have a course, I developed a course on lyrics and management where we provide them soft power, social movements. So all integrating humanities and social sciences into management education. I think that will somehow try to bridge this gap.
Yeah,
so,
I just want to applaud you for everything that you said, because it's fascinating that you're doing this, and I'm seeing a lot of other Indian business schools. I can certainly cite a number of other examples of people trying it, doing it. I just want to be sure that we continue to encourage it, continue to experiment, continue to learn, continue to share our learning. I'd love for us to be saying, here's what I learned, here's what worked well, here's what didn't. And again, just as we were talking before, SP Jain does this thing on their Abudaya program where they have to mentor someone from the slums. These are very powerful things, and how you might take being and how you might take doing and how you might take emergent problem solving and do it with it, I'm agnostic about. I always say that I think of the book as a compass, not a roadmap, saying, just be sure that you're going in this direction and not, I'm not saying do this or this, don't necessarily copy what the other ones are doing. But unless one thinks about education in this other way, I just feel that at this point we have this huge opportunity to do something. I mean, most of us get into teaching and education because there's no more satisfying profession than getting a student there to understand something that they didn't understand and they suddenly understand it. We all know the thrill of that. Occasionally, there comes a time in a generation where if we do things right now, correctly now, it will affect many years to come what will happen in education. And that, of course, is an exciting opportunity. So I want to applaud you for what you said and to encourage you to keep doing it and others to try and collectively learn.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I actually come from United States and a neighboring state from Massachusetts. I'm with the University of Connecticut School of Business. And this is a very timely talk because we are going through some of the problems that you just described. In my 20-plus years at UConn, when I first started our
Just maybe the mic a little bit closer because I don't know if everyone can hear.
In my 20-plus years, when I first started there, our class size was about 125. This year, it's about 35, and the projection for next year may be as low as 25.
Wow.
UMass is going through the same problem.
Yeah.
I have friends at Georgia State and Georgia Tech. They are going through the same problems. And I don't think this is going to reverse anytime soon, because one of the points that you did not make, which we are benefiting from, is that there is much more interest in specialized programs. Mm-hmm. Because a couple of years ago, we started a program in financial risk management, and we are flooded with applications. Mm-hmm. Lots of applications from China, lots of applications from India. So on one hand, we are losing the MBA class. On the other hand, we are having tremendous amount of interest in these specialized programs. We also have a master's program in business analytics, and that's doing very well too. Mm-hmm. Now, I want to make another observation about the case-oriented teaching, because we all do that, and we are all grateful for this approach that Harvard really started. But one of the things that I have been noticing for the last few years is that the moment I give them the case, the very first question that they ask me, even before they have read the case, is, Professor, can you give us the list of questions? That defeats the whole purpose. That the whole purpose of the case is really to provoke and inspire them to think.
Yeah.
But if you give them the questions immediately, then you have killed it.
Yeah.
So these days, I don't even give them the questions. I don't even give them the case. I actually start from the back of the case. I start from the data. So I show them the data, and I tell them, and I ask them, tell me what you can do with this data.
Yeah.
And it goes much better. Yeah. So I think you may want to think about that this whole system that has been developed over the years, and I'm sure Harvard is aware of this, that students know about these questions, and they are being handed down year after year after year. Yeah. So, this case approach is very, very helpful, but I think students have figured it out. Yeah. that the professor is somewhat lazy, and of the 10 cases that were assigned last year, 5 will be assigned again.
Yeah.
So they know what to do. So they figured it out.
Well, and it's not just the 5 that were assigned last year, as you're correctly picking
Right.
up. So one of the big advantages we talked about information technology, we've already addressed. One of the big disadvantages of information technology is, of course, if you put a case analysis on the web, it's easy for you to Google and search it and
Absolutely.
do it. And of course, I know that my students haven't become suddenly that much smarter. So suddenly when you do it and someone, it's a tough case, you don't expect that someone would be able to crack it, and they crack it, that, they might have gone onto the web and found out an answer that might have been available. So that certainly could be the case.
Yeah.
We're trying more and more, and these are tough, you're exactly correct. So more and more trying to go to what we call live cases is very good. So just get data on some event that has happened and put it there. Much more work, by the way, on your part as it is on ours, because you won't have a teaching note, you won't have all the usual support that we provide. And then the other side of it is, of course, the cases always had only one question at the end of the case. There was a protagonist, and the question was, what should John Smith do?
Yes. Exactly.
There was no thing about, why don't you work this out? And no. I mean, you're the decision maker. You're trying to make a decision. And this comes back to this decision-making skill. So we, of course, feel that the case method allows you to do a little bit more of it. But that's a battle that, unfortunately, is lost because there are things going out. It's on the web.
Well, I mean, I'll make one last point that let's say there are 5 groups in the class.
Yeah.
I will give the questions at the end to one group, and the other 4 groups will be allowed to analyze the case the way they want.
Yeah.
It's always the other 4 groups that do better.
Do better, yeah. I mean, it's no question.
Now, you also mentioned experiential learning, and we have 5 different accelerators. And the funny thing about it is that in those accelerators, we actually invite business projects so that the students participate. Now, the class size is so small that we can't even run those accelerators now. So the small size of MBA programs is something that unfortunately may not be reversed soon, unless some of the things that you are discussing, and I may actually go back and invite you to come in because we have formed a special task force to look into some of the issues that we are discussing, and we are only about an hour's drive from Harvard, so I'll possibly invite you to come in and present.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Happy to look at it. All right.
If I may, yes.
Surely.
My name is Gilles Van Wyck. I'm from ESSEC in France, so the 3rd continent.
A little bit closer to your...
Yes, okay. My question is about, I think first that the experiential learning is extremely important. It is really the right way to go. I think there has been some kind of a deep transformation taking place, and indeed we move from knowledge to integrating the knowledge and learning to integrate it. Now, I believe also maybe there are some cultural differences. And when you talked about critical thinking, I thought, well, in fact, when I asked my French students to do an assignment like the example you gave, they actually do a very good job.
Correct.
But of course, this is just one point, and they have to learn a lot of other things.
Yes.
So altogether, I think we have all of us, I guess, all the institutions, probably to go in that direction. I would even say that the problem finding is one of the very important points at the beginning. And once we are there, the question I really have at this point is how do we make sure that the students actually were able to assimilate the second level that we want to teach them, that is a method rather than discuss a case or new product. And I was wondering, do you have any process where you check, in fact, that maybe the students writing an essay to tell what they learned, how they learned it, in order to see if they have actually developed the understanding, which is really crucial in this
Correct.
aspect.
And both very good points. Many of these exercises, as you're describing, have that flavor to it. I don't think there's a right answer because, that's not the purpose of the exercise. But there is a way to see whether, in fact, they have missed obvious points. So that's one thing. But where it becomes even more powerful is when you combine the two. So when they come back and someone holds a different point of view to the one that they have held, and then you get that discussion going, when there's a second point of view discussed when looking at the same set of facts, that's when the real magic happens in these particular courses. So you're right that these are things that we've done in the past in an important, interesting way. We've sort of gotten away from it a little bit more, and this is the point I was making earlier. This is a combination of how do you get the you don't want to lose the analytics. By no stretch of the imagination does rethinking the MBA ever